All right, we are ready to start. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we're getting right into it. So, last week is when the Torah introduces Abraham to us. Now, just to be fair, the truth is the end of the week before, the end of Parshat Noach, is when we learn of the birth of Abraham. And the truth is, last week, Abraham was already 75 at the beginning of the Torah portion. So, the Torah really develops Abraham's character in last week's Torah portion, and we learned a lot about him. And we also had 6 of the 10 tests of faith that God requests of Abraham that Abraham passes. So the first 6 of them were passed in last week's Torah portion, and then the subsequent 4 are fulfilled and passed in this week's Torah portion. So I want to just give a quick review. Now, I want to, again, reiterate, there are different opinions on what those 10 tests were. There's a range between 2 or 3 different ones, which may be counted or not be counted. But I want to go with the main opinion, and that is the opinion of Maimonides, the Rambam, who lists the 10 tests as follows. The first one is the Lech Lecha test. That's the beginning of last week's Torah portion, where God tells Abraham he has to leave his homeland and go to a land that is unknown. It's the promised land, but he doesn't even know where he's going. That's the first test. The second test was immediately upon his arrival in this promised land, there is a famine, and he is forced to leave. So you're promised something. As soon as you get there, no, promise is done. That was his second test. Third test was when he had to come to Egypt. This is last week's Torah portion. When he has to come to Egypt, his wife, Sarah, was abducted, taken by Paro, and there was that whole test and story in and of itself. The fourth test was Abraham facing against all odds, that tremendous battle of World War I, as I call it, versus 5 kings versus 4 kings, and Abraham had to win that. That was with the capturing of his very own nephew that he, thank God, was able to succeed in. Next was the 5th test that Abraham endured, was the fact that he had to marry Hagar, his wife's maidservant, in order to have a child, which again was against every part of Abraham's being. The 6th test, and that's the end of last week's Torah portion, was the test that Abraham is given by God to circumcise himself at the age of 90. At the age of 99. And this was a very, very advanced age, a very, very hard thing for Abraham to fulfill, obviously. Now, this week we read about the next 4 tests. The first this week, this is the 7th test of Abraham, is when Sarah is again captured by the king of Gerar, again captured in order to take as his own wife. 8th test is the fact that Abraham had to send Hagar away after having a child with her. This was because of the tremendous amount of disrespect between Hagar and Sarah, but more importantly because of leads us into the next one, the 9th test, because of Ishmael being a horrible example for his chosen son, Isaac. And that was the 9th test. The final test, and that's what we're going to speak about tonight, is the Akedat Yitzchak, as we say in Hebrew. In English, it is when God commands Abraham to sacrifice his dear son, Isaac, upon the altar. And this was, as we're going to explain, the hardest test by far. Can you imagine? Even harder than circumcising oneself, even harder than going to a place which is completely unknown. This one took the, I guess it was the cherry on the top, and it was really, really the hardest. So I want to share with you the following verse, and this verse is going to really, really enlighten us to, again, what type of commitment Abraham was really committed to when it comes to God. This is the Zera Shimshon's a fascinating chidush. Take a look. I'm on chapter 22 in Genesis, verse 12. The verse says as follows. This is after Abraham already comes and he brings his son, and after he was told by the angel not to sacrifice his son. Again, Abraham was told, come and sacrifice your son. When he comes to sacrifice his son, he picks up as the Torah says, the machelet, which was the knife to slaughter his son, and he comes to slaughter his son, and he is told, no, don't do so. Don't do so. God says he trusts you, that you are completely faithful to him. So look at what it says over here. Vayomer al tishlach yadecha lanar v'al taslo me'uma. It was told to Abraham, no, do not stretch forth your hand to the lad, nor the slightest thing to him. Because God says, Ki ata yadati. You see, I have that highlighted. Now I know, Ki yere Elohim ata, that you are a God-fearing man, velo hasachta et bincha et yechidecha mimeni. And you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. So this is a powerful, powerful line. This was the line where everything came and kind of hit Abraham in the face. He was trying to almost, and just understand the psychology of what was going through Abraham's mind. Each of the tests were extremely difficult, very, very hard for Abraham. But nothing was harder than this last one. And Abraham was almost trying to fool himself that it wouldn't happen, yet it would happen. And it was this uncommunicated conversation between Abraham and even his son Isaac. As when we go through the end of this week's Torah portion, we'll pay attention how they are having this conversation that someone's going to be, or something's going to be sacrificed, but they know who it is, but they don't say who it is. It's a very, very convoluted situation. However, when Abraham is there and he gets there and he binds his son, and Isaac looks at his dad when he realizes what's happening, he says, Father, where is the animal that's going to be slaughtered? And at that point, Abraham tells his son, don't worry, God will show us the animal that will be slaughtered. At that point, Isaac realized, oh, okay, I know where this is going. I'm the one that's being slaughtered. Okay. So when his father tells him, okay, now put yourself on the altar, the Midrash says Isaac tells his father, tie me up, Abba. Because God forbid, I don't want to fight back. I don't want to flinch. I don't want to fidget. I don't want to kick out my hands or arms, hurt you, God forbid, while you're sacrificing me. So this was all said and done. At that point, this verse comes and says that an angel came out and called out to Abraham and says, Abraham, stop. Do not continue. God considers it as if you have done it, that you have not even withheld your son, your only son, meaning your chosen son, from him. So take a look back at this verse, and the Zera Shimshon asks a powerful question. His first question that he asks is, he says, Ata yadati, one second, now I know that you are faithful, and not any earlier? I mean, 9 tests were fulfilled and completed by Abraham. None of them were too easy. They were all a tremendous challenge. We just went through the whole list of them. But no. God says, now I know that you are completely faithful. That's his first question. And his second question is, if you look at the end of the verse where it says that God says, you did not withhold your son from me, your only son, from me, mimeni. You see that last word in the verse? It's highlighted in yellow as well. The Zera Shimshon says that is a completely superfluous word. The concept, the message that the Torah is trying to show us, that which God is trying to portray to Abraham could have been easily understood if the verse would have just said, Velo chasachta et bincha et yechidecha, that you've not withheld your son, your only son. Why does it say mimeni, from me? It seems to be completely extra. So, having said that, the Zera Shimshon answers in a beautiful way. He says that Avraham Avinu, he personified the trait of chesed, of loving kindness, in every which way. He would share his goodness onto the entire world. That's what Abraham was. He was a beam of love and light and kindness onto everyone he interacted with. Now, a person may come to think, the Zera Shimshon says, that it was Abraham's good nature, that he liked pleasing everyone, that he liked doing good for everyone, obeying everyone. And that nature is what allowed him to not only withstand, but fulfill and even succeed through the 10 tests that God gave him. That it was only because that was the nature of Abraham. He was a good-natured person. He was a nice person. He was one who wanted to fulfill and to do that which anyone asked him to do, whether it was to feed them, whether it was to clothe them, to wash them, to host them in whichever way it was. And therefore, the Zera Shimshon says, some would say, you know why these tests were fulfilled by Abraham? Easy schmeezy. Abraham was able to fulfill him because that was his God-given nature. And it wasn't because he feared God, loved God, or even understood God. It's because anyone that asked or requested anything from him was what he fulfilled. Says the Zera Shimshon proposes, one would have thought. And therefore, if that was Abraham's nature, he doesn't really deserve any merit. He may be a minor merit, but not a tremendous merit, not the promised land, not for his descendants to be numerous and to inhabit this land. Comes the Zera Shimshon and says, you know what God divinely orchestrated? He put together a series of hand-chosen tests, 10 tests, which were hard, which were tailor-made for Abraham, which would test Abraham's nature. Now let's go back to this. The tests were not done for God's sake. Did God know that Abraham was faithful? 100%. God sees and understands everything in one's mind, in one's heart, in every which way and aspect of a person. The tests were twofold. It was not for God, it was for Abraham. Because when a person fulfills a test, they achieve a new level. They now have proven to themselves they're able to do it. It's like a person who studies to become a doctor. They study. But until they pass the test, they have not really proven it to themselves that they are capable and able of doing it. And you can take that concept for so many different other examples. So the test was for Abraham, but it was also for all onlookers, all doubters, all those who are on the fence. Do they commit to Abraham's God and way of life or not? And therefore, God, says the Zera Shimshon, tailor-made these 10 tests. These tests which tested Abraham's nature of love and compassion and giving. But the 10th one was the greatest of the tests. The 10th test was a test against cruelty, against Abraham's nature, against any common sense in human nature. It is the epitome of what Abraham was going away from. What did God tell Abraham to leave? He said to leave his father's home, his country, his birthplace, his father's home. They believed in idolatry. They believed in self-sacrifice. They believed in sacrificing their own children. So imagine how the storyline runs, how it reads. Abraham, age of 75, goes completely cuckoo. He believes in this new God. He leaves town. He leaves everything behind. He destroys his father's business and reputation. He comes to a certain land, famine. Okay, so his God's doing him really well. He has to leave. He goes to Egypt, and his wife's abducted. And then he comes back, and he has to fight a world war. And then he can't have children, even though that was his promise. He has to circumcise himself. His wife's abducted again. He sends his maidservant and his firstborn Ishmael away. Nothing's going good for Abraham. And now on top of it all, Abraham claims that God, his God, is telling him to do exactly what he was told to walk away from. And that's to sacrifice his own son and his promised son. His son, which is supposed to continue his great legacy and his descendants to inherit this land and populate it and lead the world in a light of God. I hope I'm not convincing anybody that Abraham made a mistake, God forbid. But this was the greatest test. You see, the oxymoron of doing one thing and then the contradiction of doing another, that was Abraham's great faith. And that was his success in his test. God was testing human nature, and God was testing Abraham's nature of chesed. How can you explain chesed, love and kindness, to slaughter your own son? That went against the grain of Abraham. And that's when God knew, now I know, ata yadati. Now God says, I know that everything you've done is true, and you are 100% committed. This is the proof that you are doing it for me, God says, and not because it's your nature. And now why does it have to say the last word of mimeni? Meaning that, let's go back to the verse, show everyone. The verse ends off, and now I know that you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. From me, explains the Zera Shimshon, from me, that all of your actions that you did were done for me. Mimeni. You did it for me. This one, like all the rest, none of them was your nature. It was not your nature to leave your father's house, not your nature to do any of those tests. And that was what defined Abraham as one of the greatest human beings to ever walk the face of this earth, as an innovator, as a visionary, as a true seeker of truth and of God. So the lesson I bring from this is that in life, there come certain situations where I like to coin them as the moment of truth. And a person has an obligation, let's rephrase that, not an obligation, an opportunity to rise to that occasion, to the occasion they were created for. Everyone has those moments in life. And often it may be more than one. Sometimes it may only be one. So Abraham had, I'd say, 9 mini moments of truth, but his one moment of truth, his pinnacle, was this moment of when he brought his son, when he was commanded to sacrifice his son, and he was willing to go through with it. Now, it was so amazing that he was willing to go through with it. He didn't go through with it, and God gave him the merit as if he went through with it. That is something amazing. Now, we have to realize that these moments of truth normally go against our nature. For some of us, it would be controlling our anger. For others, it would be controlling our moral and ethical beliefs, being honest and truthful and trustworthy. For others, it may be having to move from one place to another, or sever a relationship, or engage in a relationship, rekindle a relationship. For each and every one of us, there are times in our life where we need to activate ourselves. We need to turn on. We need to become our best self. And most of the time, that's going to be our greatest test. And most of the time, if we look in our lives, the tests that come our way are tests against our nature, just as it was for Abraham. Now, overcoming a test is no easy task. And that's why it's called a test. And just to finish off this segment, how do we know if we're being tested or tormented? That's a great question. 2 T's, test or torment, all right? So there's one aspect we're able to understand, and that's while we're going through it. But in essence, we will never really know 100% if while we're going through it, if it's a test or a torment, until after the fact. And listen to what I mean. A test is an indicator that we're going through a test is when we are really, really struggling to overcome this. And that's because it's going against our nature. And it often seems impossible for us to overcome this test. And this is where belief comes into play. Because when a person believes that everything that happens to them is orchestrated by God, whether it's happening directly by God or through a messenger, whether it's through nature, through another person, through physical things in our lives, emotional aspects of our life, when a person truly believes and has faith, unwavering trust, that God is orchestrating every aspect of our lives, then we understand everything that happens for us to be a torment. And this is what I mean by after the fact, we're able to look back and say, yes, it was a test. Because when we go after the fact and we look back and we say, wow, that was the hardest time in my life and I strove, I thrived, I grew from it. Opposed to looking back and saying, oh, I sunk and I became depressed over it and I couldn't push through it and I gained nothing from it. On the contrary, even when a person loses a handful, but when they gain a new handful or sometimes multiple handfuls, they realize, wow, to trade this for that, even though it was not our intention or our will, but when we understand it was the will of God and we gained so much from it, that's how we understand we can define our test as a test and not a torment. So in essence, a true believer, a true person who lives with God day in, day out, and we all need our reminders, and that's why we're learning about this, is there's no such thing as being tormented. Because God, chas v'shalom, God forbid, is not this kid at the top of the hill with a magnifying glass trying to burn ants. That is not the image of God that we have, that the Torah portrays to us. To the contrary, God is a loving God who wants to bestow good onto us. He wants to bestow good just as a parent wants to bestow good. And sometimes a parent has to exert tough love, and so does God. And these tests are not for the parent. And these tests are not for God. These tests are for the child. They're for us. They're for us to grow from, to thrive with, to succeed, to untap and unlock greater areas within our mind, our soul, and our body that we maybe didn't even know we had the capabilities of doing. So with that in mind, I want to wrap up this first segment, and this first segment taught us how Abraham's tests were against his nature. God tested it against his nature, so no one would say, oh, Abraham was a good-natured individual, and that's why he was able to fulfill all these tests. To the contrary, God says, now I know that not only this 10th test was a complete commitment on your end to me, but all of the previous ones were as well, and everybody knows that you did all of this for me. And may we all rise to those moments of truth that will come in our life and look back and say there were defining moments in our life, and sometimes we stood up to the test and fulfilled it and succeeded, and sometimes maybe we didn't. But there will be more of those moments in our lives, and let us not let those great opportunities slip through our fingers and miss on them, God forbid.